Everyone agrees that the FAA plays an important role in air safety. I don't think there's any real discussion or debate on either side with that regard. My amendment calls, though, for having spending levels at 2008. This is actually what's going to be produced out of the House. The House has already published their spending proposals, and most of their spending proposals will be at the 2008 level. This is a small down payment on the debt. Some say, oh, this is a wrong place to start, but you got to start somewhere. Everybody says they're going to be for balancing the budget or tackling the debt or doing this. You don't get there unless you cut spending. Now, you can't create a situation where you make it an either-or situation. Either we have air safety or we don't have air safety, depending on a spending level. Perhaps you can spend money more wisely. Perhaps the job of a legislator is to find out how you spend money, how you find savings, and how you make do with less. If we don't, we're never going to get out of this problem. The deficit is an enormous burden on all of us, on our kids and our grandkids. The last election was about the deficit, about the mounting debt. But the other side doesn't seem to have listened to this. They also need to understand what the deficit does to jobs. Our debt, our national debt now is approaching our gross domestic product. That means our debt is about equal to what we produce as an economy for a year, as our whole country. When it does, there are estimates that it kills the rate of growth of our economy by 1% and costs 1 million jobs a year. This is from the debt. They're talking about what $2 billion will do within one agency. We're talking about what $14 trillion worth of debt does to an entire economy. 1% loss of growth and 1 million jobs a year. The debt, the national debt, is killing us. So we had an intervening election and a message was sent. The message was, listen to the American people. They're upset about passing this debt to our kids and our grandkids. So we got a response. The president laid out his budget this week. You know what his budget will do? The president's budget will spend $46 trillion. I'm not making that up. $46 trillion over 10 years. That means to me and tells me that the other side didn't get the message. $46 trillion over 10 years. Now, what does this mean? The debt when President Obama came into office was about $7 billion, $8 billion maybe. We're now going to triple that debt. If he wins a second term, the president will have tripled the national debt in 8 years. His 10-year proposal will double the debt in just 10 years. The deficit this year alone will be $1.65 trillion. The president has said, well, he's going to freeze spending. Well, he's going to freeze spending in this little tiny percentage of the budget, about 12% of the budget. It's not enough and doesn't do it. Now, the Republicans want to go back to 2008 level, which is what I'm proposing here. It's not enough either, because you're only looking at one tiny sliver of the budget. Today, we're looking at one small program. The problem here is people are starting to recognize the problem of the debt, but they're unwilling to do what it takes to look at the entire budget. You're going to have to look at military spending. You're going to have to look at non-military discretionary spending, and ultimately, you're going to have to look at entitlements. But you have to say, every program has something good about it. Everybody can stand up here and say, we need next gen. I'm for next gen. But the thing is, if you're a legislator and you have less money, let's figure out where we find the money in the existing budget. I proposed some other alternatives. I proposed $500 million in savings by saying, you know what, when we build airports, let's don't make it be the union wage or the prevailing wage. Let's have the market wage. That would have saved $500 million. That goes a long way towards funding next gen. Another $500 million, $400 to $500 million, is in the unprofitable airports that we're going to subsidize in this bill. There are savings that can be found, but we never find them. In Washington, what do we tend to do? If we want something, we just add more money to the bill. And there's always arguments for these programs, but we have to also understand what are the consequences of a $14 trillion debt. President Obama's 10-year plan that he released this week will change $14 trillion into nearly $27 trillion. The numbers are mind-boggling. If we don't do something about it, it's a threat to our country. The president's own Secretary of Defense has said the #1 threat to our national security is our debt. It's out of control. I don't think the problem is fully grasped by either side, but I know if we're here today and can't come to an agreement to save $2 billion, think about it. I'm asking to save $2 billion out of a budget of $3.7 trillion. It's such a small number. They might argue, well, it's such a small number, why even do it? If you don't start somewhere, how will you ever balance the budget? How will we ever get out of this mess if we're not willing to save $2 billion? It's a start. It's a down payment. It's how we can say to the American people, we heard you in November. We realize we cannot pass this debt on to our kids and our grandkids, and that something has to be done. But instead, what we get from the other side is that we make this into, well, the other side's not for progress. They're not for developing airports. They're not for GPS systems at the airport. It's not that simple. I'm for all of those things, but I'm for saying let's step up as legislators and say, how do we find the savings in the existing budget? Because the alternative is, how are we going to pay for $14 trillion in debt? How are we going to pay for $26 trillion in debt that's going to be added if the president gets his 10-year plan? You can pay for debt in a variety of ways. You can tax people, but as you can tell by the movement out there, most of us think we're taxed enough already. The average taxpayer is often paying 40 and 50% of his income. The average taxpayer is paying more in taxes than they do for food and clothing and transportation and all their expenses. They pay more in taxes. So I don't think the general public wants to raise taxes. The other way is you stick your head in the sand and just keep borrowing. That's what we've been doing. We just keep borrowing and borrowing. But it threatens our very economy and it threatens our country. Now, how does a country also pay for debt? Are we going to default on our debt? No, ultimately we'll just print money to pay for it. But there's a downside to that too. Countries have ruined their currency. Germany in the 1920s destroyed their currency. If you look at the curve of what happened to the currency in the 1920s, it happened over a period of about 6 months. You had bread that sold for 100 marks, and then 1,000,000 marks, and then 100 million marks, and then 1,000,000,000 marks. The money became so devalued that it was of more value to actually burn as a fuel. People went around with wheelbarrows full of money. The workers demanded to be paid 2 and 3 times a day. That's what happens to a country that has a massive debt. You can't tax people enough. In Greece just went through default recently. And as Greece went through default, they tried to raise taxes, but everybody was paying too much already, so everything was forced into the underground, and you could raise the tax rates 90%. You didn't get any more money. When you increase tax rates, you don't always get more money. The money just went underground. Or you can print the money, but if you just simply print the money, you destroy people's savings. You steal from those who have saved, and you take the value of their dollar. So this bill really is the beginning of the debate. It's the first bill we've had to come forward with a new Congress that talks about money. It's a very small down payment. I'm asking for a little over $2 billion in savings. It's the 2008 levels. It's what the House is asking for. You have to realize also what happened between 2008 and 2011. You know how much spending went up? Spending went up by 24%. Spending is just out of control in this city, and we have to realize the consequences. If we stood up here and had an argument over whether next gen is a good thing, there's no argument. It's a good thing. We should have GPS. We have GPS in our cars. For certain, we should have it in our airports. I'm all for modernizing the airports. But what I'm saying is it's irresponsible as legislators to stand up here and just say more, more, more. We're going to spend more money. We can't do it. And the thing is it's not just the program. We're not talking about whether the program is justified or whether we should spend money. We're talking about what are the consequences of a massive debt. And I think that's where we are. The American people know this. They instinctively know this. And I think there's a great danger to not stepping up. I wish the other side would have come back and said, why don't we split the difference and try to save $1.5 billion? That's what compromise would be in this city. If they don't want to save $2.5 billion, let's save $1.5 billion. But the thing is we need to start saving money everywhere. And it can't be that every program you want to cut is somebody else's program, and then when it gets to be your program that you're interested in, you won't cut it. Everybody's got a self-interest in their program. Every special interest in this town and the country's got a special interest. It got an interest in their particular spending. So I'd say this is a small down payment. This is a way to say to the American people, we've heard you in the election, we know there's a problem, we're going to start cutting spending. I urge my fellow senators to vote for this amendment. It is something that has nothing to do with quality, has nothing to do with whether you believe in air safety. It has to do with whether or not you think the debt is a problem, whether or not you think the debt is a threat to us as a country, and whether or not we're going to step up and do the responsible thing. Mr. President, I yield back my time at this point. No, I ask unanimous consent to allow Senator Rockefeller to speak, and I'll reserve my time.